Jake Matthews had always preferred the quiet solitude of the open plains to the noise and chaos of the world. A tall man with rough hands, his life was simple. His days were spent tending to his cattle, fixing fences, and making sure his ranch was in good shape. He didn't care much for company, and most of his time was spent in the company of his horse Thunder and the wide open sky that stretched endlessly above him. Jake had inherited the ranch from his father, who had passed away years ago. Since then, he'd been running it alone, content with the life he'd chosen. His routine was predictable and steady. Wake up at dawn, work the land, and sleep under the stars. He liked it that way. But all that was about to change, and it started with something as simple as an auction. It was the middle of spring, a time when the air was warm and the earth seemed to hum with life. Jake was making his way into town for the annual cattle auction, which was one of the few events he attended each year. He didn't particularly enjoy these gatherings, but he knew they were important. They were the best way to purchase new livestock or sell off some of the herd that he had no need for. As he rode into town on Thunder, Jake could already hear the noise of the crowd in the distance. People were shouting, negotiating prices, and haggling over cattle and horses. It was the typical scene. Traders, farmers, and ranchers all gathered in one place, making deals and exchanging livestock. The smell of dust and leather filled the air, mixing with the faint scent of hay and sweat. Jake tied Thunder to a post and made his way into the crowd. He wasn't in a rush. He had no interest in anything other than buying a few new cattle for his ranch. But as he made his way through the bustling market, something unusual caught his eye. A small makeshift stage had been set up at one end of the auction grounds, and a large crowd had gathered around it. At first, Jake thought it was just another batch of cattle being sold. But as he got closer, he realized that what was being presented wasn't cattle at all. Instead, there were two women standing on the stage. They weren't dressed like the other women Jake had seen in town. Their clothing was simple, plain dresses and moccasins. Their hair was long and dark, tied back in intricate braids. But it was the way they held themselves that caught Jake's attention. The older of the two sisters, a woman who looked to be in her early 20s, stood with her arms crossed over her chest, her gaze sharp and defiant. The younger sister, who appeared to be in her teens, stood slightly behind her, her eyes wide and unsure. Jake paused, confused. What was going on? Why were these women up for auction? He couldn't help but overhear a few whispered comments from the crowd around him. "They're Apache," one man said. "Belong to a man who's fallen on hard times. He's selling them to pay off his debts." Jake's eyebrows furrowed. Apache? That meant they were native to the land, to a different way of life. He had heard stories about Apache people, about their skills as warriors and their deep connection to the land, but he had never expected to see them here in the midst of this auction, as if they were nothing more than property. The auctioneer, a man with a sharp voice and a tall hat, began to speak. "All right, folks, let's move on to the next lot. Lot number 12, two Apache women. The older one, etched, is 23, and the younger, Nayeli, is 17. They're strong, capable, and ready to work. Who'll start the bidding?" Jake blinked in disbelief. This was a mistake. It couldn't be real. He had come to buy cattle, not people. But before he could turn away, something inside him hesitated. The crowd was already buzzing, and men were raising their hands, offering bids as the auctioneer called out numbers. Jake's mind was racing. What was happening here? How could people treat these women like this? But the auctioneer kept going, his voice growing more insistent. "Anyone for $20? 25, 30? The numbers were climbing fast. Jake's gut twisted. He didn't know what to do. The older woman, etched, stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the ground. Her posture was strong, but there was a sadness in her eyes that Jake couldn't ignore, and the younger one, Nayeli, looked like she wanted to run but was clearly too frightened to move. Before Jake could process what was happening, his hand shot up. It was an impulse, a reflex more than anything else. He hadn't meant to bid, but in the chaos of the moment, his action went unnoticed. The auctioneer spotted the raised hand and shouted, $25 going once, $30 going twice, and sold. "Lot number 12 goes to this gentleman right here." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't meant to buy them. He had only raised his hand out of confusion. But now the deal was done. He had just purchased two Apache women, and there was no turning back. The crowd around him seemed to have lost interest, and the noise of the auction began to fade into the background. Jake felt like he was in a daze. He looked at the two women on stage, their expressions unreadable. Atsadi's eyes met his for the first time, and she didn't seem surprised, just resigned. Nayeli, on the other hand, still seemed unsure of what was happening, her gaze darting nervously from one person to the next. The auctioneer handed Jake a set of papers and a leather pouch, and with a hurried, "Enjoy," he turned and moved on to the next lot, leaving Jake alone with his strange new purchase. Jake stood there, his hands shaking slightly as he held the papers. He had no idea what to do next. He had expected to spend the day buying cattle, not people. The weight of the situation was starting to sink in. He had no experience with people from different cultures, and the idea of suddenly being responsible for two strangers, especially in such a delicate situation, was overwhelming. He looked over at the women, who were still standing there waiting for him. It was clear they weren't pleased with the situation either, but there was little they could do. "All right," Jake muttered to himself. "Let's get this over with." He walked toward the stage, his boots kicking up dust as he approached the sisters. Atsadi didn't say a word, but her eyes followed him closely. He felt awkward, unsure of what to say. He had bought them, but he had no idea how to handle this responsibility. "Come on," Jake said, more to himself than to them. "Let's go. I'll get you settled." The women didn't resist, but neither did they show any sign of relief. They followed him in silence as he led them to where Thunder was tied. As they made their way out of the bustling auction area, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken an unexpected turn. He had no idea how this would unfold, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. Jake didn't know what to expect as he rode back to his ranch with the two Apache women in tow. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the land. He couldn't shake the feeling that this entire situation had turned his life upside down. The awkward silence between him, Atsadi, and Nayeli made it clear that neither side knew how to handle what had just happened. Jake's mind raced as he thought about what to do next. He had purchased cattle before, but never people. Never two women from a completely different culture. He didn't even know where to begin. He glanced at the two women, their expressions unreadable as they sat silently behind him on their own horses. Atsadi, the older sister, rode with a stiff posture, her eyes focused straight ahead. Nayeli, the younger one, kept her head down, her long dark hair partially covering her face. The ride back to Jake's ranch was long, but Jake kept his eyes on the path ahead, trying to focus on the landscape rather than the tension in the air. He had grown up on this land, had spent his whole life here, and yet now everything felt foreign. The ranch was his world, but for Atsadi and Nayeli it was a place they had never seen before. He had no idea how they felt about being here, about being with him, but the silence between them said enough. As they approached the ranch, Jake dismounted from Thunder and looked around. The land was vast, with nothing but the rolling hills and scattered trees as far as the eye could see. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of the wind and the distant calls of birds. Jake had always found peace in the isolation of his ranch, but now it seemed lonely, and the two women he had brought here with no idea of what had just happened made it feel even more isolated. Atsadi was the first to speak as she dismounted, her voice low and steady. "You don't know what you've done," she said, her words cutting through the stillness of the air. Jake looked at her, unsure of how to respond. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know what was happening at the auction," he said, his voice thick with uncertainty. "But now that you're here, I'll try to make it right." Atsadi didn't look at him as she spoke again. "It's not just about being here. You have no idea what you've done to our people, our family. You've taken us from our land." Jake felt a pang of guilt hit him. He had only meant to buy livestock for his ranch, but somehow he had ended up in the middle of something far bigger than himself. He didn't know the full story, but he could see that Atsadi and Nayeli were more than just objects to be traded. They were people, with their own past, their own history. Nayeli, who had been silent until now, looked up at Jake with wide eyes. "You didn't mean to, did you?" she asked quietly. There was a sadness in her voice, but also a kind of hope, as if she believed there was still a chance that things could be different. Jake shook his head. "No, I didn't mean to, but I can't change what's happened. All I can do now is try to help you." Atsadi didn't seem convinced. She turned away, walking toward the small cabin on the ranch where Jake had lived for years. She hadn't said much since they arrived, and her silence made Jake uneasy. He didn't know how to fix this, but he knew one thing for sure. He didn't want to be part of the problem. He had to do something, anything, to make things right. Over the next few days, things didn't improve much. Atsadi remained distant and cold, refusing to speak unless absolutely necessary.
Nayeli, on the other hand, seemed a little more open, but she too struggled with the situation.
Jake tried his best to communicate with them, to make them feel comfortable on his land, but he felt like he was speaking a language they didn't understand. Jake tried to show them his way of life, the tasks he did every day on the ranch. He had the sisters help him with simple chores, feeding the animals, mending fences, and collecting firewood. At first, Atsadi refused to do anything, sitting on the porch of the cabin with a scowl on her face. But slowly, over time, Jake saw small changes. When he asked them to help with the cattle, Atsadi hesitated, then joined him without a word. Nayeli, more curious, followed suit. It was during one of these chores that Jake learned something surprising about Atsadi. They were gathering firewood from the nearby woods when Jake noticed her moving, with remarkable speed and grace, her movements sharp and efficient. He had no idea how she knew the land so well, but she seemed to have a natural understanding of the terrain, as though she had lived here her whole life. Atsadi, Jake asked, his voice tentative, "How do you know this land so well? You're not from here." She didn't look at him but answered in a quiet voice, "I know the land better than you think. The Apache people have lived here for centuries. We understand the rhythm of the earth. We know the trees, the water, the animals. This land is not just soil and rocks to us. It's part of us." Jake was taken aback by her words. He had always thought of the land as something to be worked, to be tamed. But to Atsadi it was more than that. It was a living, breathing entity, a part of her people's soul. As the days passed, Jake began to realize how much he had taken for granted. The knowledge that Atsadi and Nayeli possessed about survival, about nature, was something he had never fully appreciated. He had always worked the land in a way that was mechanical, practical. But now, under the sisters' guidance, he started to see the land in a different light. Jake began to listen more closely to the sisters. He learned that Atsadi and Nayeli had been forced from their tribe's land, that their family had been scattered, and that they had suffered great losses. The more he heard about their story, the more Jake realized how little he knew about the world beyond his ranch. He had always thought of his life as hard and tough, but compared to what the sisters had gone through, it seemed small and insignificant. The sisters, too, started to soften a little. Atsadi, though still distant, began to speak more, offering advice on how to track animals or find fresh water. Nayeli, who had been so shy at first, started to ask questions about life on the ranch. She seemed fascinated by the different ways Jake managed his cattle and worked with the land. One evening, as they sat around a fire after a long day of work, Jake found himself thinking about the future. He knew he couldn't change the past, but perhaps he could help these women find a place for themselves here. Maybe, just maybe, they could all find a way to make this work. For the first time since bringing them here, Jake didn't feel like he was simply living in his own world. He felt like he was part of something bigger, a life that included Atsadi and Nayeli, two women from a world he didn't fully understand. But as the fire crackled and the stars sparkled above them, Jake felt a sense of possibility. This new life might not be easy, but it was worth trying. Days turned into weeks, and the once tense and awkward atmosphere between Jake, Atsadi, and Nayeli slowly began to change. It wasn't a sudden shift, but more like the land itself changing. Imperceptibly but steadily, the bond between them was growing, though in ways Jake hadn't anticipated. At first they were strangers, brought together by an accident of fate. But now, as time passed, it seemed as though they were finding a new rhythm together. Atsadi, the older sister, remained distant, but there was a change in her behavior. Where she had once refused to speak to Jake, she now answered him when necessary, though still with a quiet, guarded manner. She wasn't angry, but she wasn't trusting either. It was clear that her past had shaped her, and it was going to take time before she fully opened up to him. But Jake noticed something else. When she did speak, her words carried a quiet strength. She had a wisdom that came not from books but from living on the land, from surviving difficult circumstances and from learning the way of her people. One afternoon, while working together in the fields, Jake asked her about the skills she used to track animals. "How do you know where to find them?" Jake asked, his curiosity growing. Atsadi stopped what she was doing, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. "The land tells you," she replied, her voice calm and steady. "The wind shifts, the trees lean, and the ground tells you where to go. You have to listen. Nature speaks to those who are willing to hear it." Jake had never thought about the land that way. To him, the land had always been something to manage, something to work on. But Atsadi's words planted a seed in his mind, one that began to grow over the following days. He had always viewed survival as a series of tasks: feeding the cattle, mending fences, fixing the barn. But now he began to see it as something deeper, something more connected to the earth itself. As the days passed, Jake found himself listening more closely, not only to Atsadi's teachings, but to Nayeli's quieter insights as well. Nayeli was more gentle than her older sister, her demeanor soft and thoughtful. Though she was younger, her perspective often made Jake think twice about his actions. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Nayeli spoke up, her voice hesitant but kind. "Jake," she began, her dark eyes flickering with the firelight, "why did you buy us?" Jake was taken aback. He had been dreading that question. "I didn't mean to buy you," he said, looking at the fire. "It was an accident. But now that you're here, I don't want you to feel like you're trapped. I just want to make sure you're safe." Nayeli was silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on the flames. "We don't feel trapped," she said softly. "But we don't belong here either. We're from the mountains, from our people's land. It's hard to live here where everything feels so different." Jake nodded slowly. He understood, even if he couldn't fully relate. He had never been forced to leave his land. He had always felt rooted to it, like a part of the land itself. But Atsadi and Nayeli were from a world so different from his own. They had been torn from everything they knew, and Jake could see the weight of that loss in their eyes. One morning, Jake woke up earlier than usual, feeling a restless energy he couldn't explain. The sky was still dark and the air was cool and fresh, the kind of morning where the world felt like it was holding its breath. He decided to take Thunder out for a ride, hoping the quiet of the morning would clear his mind. As he rode across the open plains, the sun beginning to rise in the distance, Jake found himself thinking about Atsadi and Nayeli again. He had tried to help them adjust, but had he really done enough? He hadn't asked them what they needed. He hadn't truly understood what it meant to be a part of their world, to be connected to their people. As he rode, Jake found himself looking back at the ranch. The land stretched out before him, peaceful and undisturbed. The sound of Thunder's hooves was the only thing that broke the stillness of the morning. But as he looked, he realized something. He had never considered what it must have felt like for Atsadi and Nayeli to be here, away from their home, their people, and their traditions. Everything was unfamiliar to them, and the sense of loss was still fresh. When Jake returned to the ranch, Atsadi and Nayeli were already outside, gathering firewood. They had been working alongside him for some time now, their presence becoming a part of the rhythm of the ranch. He watched them for a moment, their movements fluid and confident as if they belonged here, but he knew they didn't feel like they did. Later that evening, as the three of them sat together for dinner, Jake finally asked the question that had been on his mind. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice unsure. "You two are Apache, and I don't know much about your people, but I want to learn. If you're willing, I want to understand your ways. I want to know what it means to be Apache so I can help you, and maybe, just maybe, help you find a way back to your people." Atsadi looked up from her plate, her eyes meeting Jake's for the first time in days. There was something in her gaze, something that was no longer filled with distrust, but something softer, more accepting. "You want to help us?" she asked, her voice low but not unkind. Jake nodded. "I don't know how. I don't know much about your culture, but I want to try. If I can help you get back to your people, or if there's anything I can do, I'll do it." For the first time, Atsadi seemed to relax. She let out a deep breath as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She looked over at Nayeli, who gave her a small nod of approval. Then slowly Atsadi spoke. "There is much you don't know about us," she said. "But if you truly want to understand, then we will show you. Our people have a deep connection to the land, to the sky, and to each other. It is not something you can learn in a day, but if you are willing to listen, then you may begin to understand." Jake felt a surge of hope. For the first time, it seemed like Atsadi and Nayeli were opening up to him, not just as the man who had bought them, but as someone who might help them find their way back home. It wasn't going to be easy, but at least now there was a possibility, a real chance to bridge the gap between two worlds, to understand each other's pain, each other's struggles. As the fire crackled and the stars sparkled above them, Jake realized that the life he had once known was changing. He wasn't just a cowboy anymore. He was part of something bigger. He was learning about a culture, a history, and a connection to the earth that he had never known before. And while the journey ahead would be difficult, it was a journey worth taking. From that moment on, Jake made a silent promise to himself. He would learn everything he could about Apache and Nayeli's world, and he would do whatever it took to help them find their place in it. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about respect, about understanding, and about finding a way for all of them to live together as equals. The days on the ranch were getting longer as Jake, Apache, and Nayeli worked together. Jake had started to feel that things were slowly falling into place, but little did he know, their peaceful life was about to face a challenge that would change everything. Despite their growing connection and the quiet understanding between them, there was still one thing that weighed heavily on all of their minds: the Apache people, Apache and Nayeli's family. Jake had been hearing whispers in town, rumors about a group of Apache warriors searching for their lost relatives. Word had spread that two Apache sisters had been sold at an auction, and while most people in the town had dismissed it as an unfortunate event, Jake knew this wasn't just a small issue. The Apache were a proud people, and their warriors were fiercely protective of their families. It was only a matter of time before someone came looking for Apache and Nayeli. It was a quiet evening when it all came to a head. Jake had just finished his work for the day and was about to sit down for dinner when he saw movement in the distance. His sharp eyes quickly caught the sight of several riders making their way across the plains. They were coming fast, and their horses kicked up clouds of dust as they approached. Jake stood up immediately, his instincts kicking in. There was something about the riders that didn't sit right with him, and he knew they weren't here for a friendly visit. Apache and Nayeli had been sitting on the porch talking quietly between themselves, but when they saw the riders, their faces turned pale. They exchanged a quick glance, and Jake could see the tension in their eyes. "They've come for us," Apache said quietly, her voice trembling ever so slightly. She stood up and quickly moved toward the cabin, her eyes darting back to the approaching riders. Jake followed her with his gaze, a sinking feeling in his stomach. He knew what was coming, but he didn't know how to handle it. He had promised to protect them, to help them, but how could he stand in the way of a group of Apache warriors looking for their family? The riders were getting closer, and it was clear that they were not slowing down. Apache stepped inside the cabin, and Jake could hear her speaking quickly to Nayeli. He didn't understand everything she said, but he could see the urgency in their movements. They were preparing for something he wasn't sure he was ready for. The riders reached the ranch gate, and their leader, a tall man with dark, intense eyes, dismounted first. He was dressed in traditional Apache clothing, with beads around his neck and a feather tied into his hair. He held himself with an air of authority, his eyes scanning the ranch like a hawk. His gaze fell on Jake, and Jake felt a chill run down his spine. This man was serious, and Jake knew he had to act quickly if he wanted to avoid a conflict. "You're the one who bought them," the man said in a low voice, his eyes narrowing. He didn't ask. He stated it as a fact. Jake could feel the weight of the man's stare, and he straightened his back, trying to keep his voice calm. "I didn't mean to buy them," Jake replied, trying to keep his words as neutral as possible. It was an accident, but now they're here, and I'm doing my best to help them." The Apache warrior's eyes flickered briefly with something like anger, but then he took a deep breath, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. "You've taken what is ours," he said quietly, his voice low but filled with authority. "You have no right to keep them." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want to make things worse for Apache and Nayeli. But the warrior's words were clear. The Apache had come to claim what they believed was theirs. "I'm not trying to keep them from you," Jake said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "I made a mistake. But they are free to go whenever they want. They're not my property." The warrior studied Jake for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. The air between them was thick with tension, and Jake could sense that the situation was precarious. Any wrong word or movement could escalate things, and Jake knew that he was standing between these two women and a group of Apache warriors. Behind him, Jake heard Apache and Nayeli step out of the cabin. their faces filled with uncertainty but also a hint of resolve. Atsadi's eyes met Jake's, and there was a moment of unspoken understanding. She wasn't afraid anymore, not like before. She was determined to stand her ground. The warrior's gaze shifted to Atsadi and Nayeli, and Jake could see the recognition in his eyes. This was no longer about cattle or land. It was about family. Atsadi and Nayeli were a part of something much bigger than this small ranch. They were part of a tribe, part of a history that Jake could never fully understand. "What do you want, then?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice calm. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he knew that the right answer could prevent violence. "If you want them to go, I'll let them. But they need to decide for themselves." The warrior glanced at Atsadi, and for a moment Jake saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Maybe it was respect. Maybe it was recognition of the bond between them. Whatever it was, it seemed to soften the warrior's stance. He didn't lower his hand from the knife, but his tone changed slightly. "We will leave them with you for now," the warrior said. "But if they decide to return, they will come with us. Their place is with their people." Jake nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. It wasn't a victory, but it was better than the alternative. "Thank you," Jake said, his voice sincere. "I'll respect their decision." The warrior gave a brief nod, then turned to his men. Without another word, they mounted their horses and began to ride off, their dust trailing behind them as they disappeared into the distance. Jake stood still, his mind racing as he watched them leave. He had known this day might come, but he hadn't expected it to happen so suddenly. The peace they had begun to build was fragile, and now it was more uncertain than ever. Atsadi and Nayeli stood beside Jake, watching the warriors disappear into the distance. The silence between them was heavy, but Jake could feel a shift. Atsadi, who had been so distant and guarded, now looked at him with something like appreciation. "You did well," she said quietly. "Better than I thought you would." Jake gave a small, tired smile. "I don't know if I did well, but I tried." Nayeli spoke up next, her voice soft but clear. "What happens now?" Jake looked at both of them, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know how this would end, but one thing was certain. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. "I don't know," Jake said honestly, "but we'll figure it out. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Atsadi and Nayeli exchanged a brief look, and in that moment Jake saw the quiet understanding between them. They weren't alone anymore. They had each other, and now they had him too. The journey ahead was uncertain, but Jake knew one thing for sure. This was no longer just about a cowboy and two Apache sisters. It was about a family, a bond that had been formed in the most unlikely of circumstances, and nothing, no warriors, no challenges would break it. Together they would face whatever came next. This expanded version of Part 4 continue. The tension from the Apache warriors' visit still hung heavy in the air. Jake couldn't help but replay the scene over and over in his mind, wondering if he had done the right thing, if he had handled it well enough. It wasn't just about protecting Atsadi and Nayeli anymore. It was about understanding them, their history, and the world they came from. Jake had never expected his life to take this turn, and now, as the days stretched on, he realized there was so much more at stake than just a ranch. The days that followed were filled with a quiet unease. Jake's usual routine of tending to the cattle and working the land was interrupted by the ever-present reminder that Atsadi and Nayeli had ties to a world he could never fully understand. He could never truly know what it was like to be an Apache, to have a people who had been displaced and torn apart by forces beyond their control. But he was learning. Little by little, the three of them had begun to find a new rhythm, and the bond that had started as an accident was now a thread that tied them all together. Atsadi, still quiet but less distant than before, began to open up more. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always comfortable. But there were moments when Jake saw glimpses of the woman she had been before everything had changed. He had learned that she was a skilled tracker, someone who could navigate the land like it was second nature. She shared these skills with him, teaching him how to read the signs of the wild, how to find water where there seemed to be none, how to know when an animal was nearby even before you saw it. Nayeli, who had once been so shy and unsure, was starting to find her voice. She was quieter than Atsadi, but had a curiosity about the world that Jake admired. She would ask him about things he had taken for granted, how fences were built, why certain plants grew in certain places, and how he knew which animals were safe and which weren't. Her questions, simple as they were, made Jake think more deeply about his own life, about what he knew and what he hadn't even realized he took for granted. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jake sat with the two women by the fire. The crackle of the flames was the only sound in the air, the world quiet around them. The day had been long and the ranch was peaceful, the cattle grazing contentedly in the distance. But Jake knew the peace they had found wasn't permanent. The Apache warriors would return. It was only a matter of time before the sisters would have to decide if they wanted to go back to their people or stay with him. "I've been thinking," Jake said, breaking the silence, "about what the warrior said that day, about you two going back to your people." Etched looked at him, her expression serious but not unkind. "We don't have a choice, Jake. Our people are still out there scattered across the land. Our family, our tribe, they're all waiting for us. It's not something we can forget." Jake nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He had known all along that they didn't belong here, at least not forever. But he wasn't ready to give up on them just yet. He had become part of their world, and they had become part of his. For the first time in his life, Jake had started to care about something beyond his own ranch, beyond his own comfort. "I understand," Jake said softly. "But what if you don't want to go back? What if you found something here with me?" The question hung in the air between them, and Jake could see the conflict in Etched's eyes. She wasn't ready to make a decision. He knew that. But for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that there was a chance they could stay here, together as a family. Maybe it wasn't perfect, and maybe it wouldn't be easy, but it felt like it was worth trying. "I don't know," Etched replied, her voice quiet. "We've been through so much already. Our people, they're not like the settlers here. They live by different rules, different ways. I don't know if I can leave that behind." Nayeli spoke up, her voice thoughtful. "But we've been here a while now, Etched. We've learned things and we've changed. Maybe it's not about going back, but about finding a new way forward." Jake felt a flicker of hope at Nayeli's words. Maybe she was right. Maybe it wasn't about choosing one life over the other, but about finding a way to blend the two worlds. He had always believed in the power of hard work, the kind of work that shaped the land and the people who lived on it. But now he saw that the land wasn't just something to be worked. It was something to be respected, something to be shared. "We can try to find a way," Jake said, his voice steady. "I'll help you. We don't have to choose one path. We can carve out a new one together." For a long time, neither Etched nor Nayeli said anything. They both looked into the fire, the flames dancing in the cool evening air. Jake could see the wheels turning in their minds. They were thinking about their people, about their past, and about the future that was waiting for them. But they were also thinking about the life they had started to build here with Jake. Finally, Etched spoke, her voice softer than before. "I don't know if we can ever fully leave our past behind, but I don't want to leave here, not yet. Not when things have started to feel like home again." Jake's heart lifted at her words. He knew it wasn't a promise, but it was a sign. They weren't ready to give up on the life they had built, and neither was he. The days that followed were filled with the same rhythm as before, working the land, tending to the animals, learning from one another. But there was something different now. The unease that had lingered ever since the Apache warriors had come had started to fade, replaced by something stronger. The three of them were beginning to understand each other in ways that went beyond language or culture. They had built something together, and it was something worth protecting. One day, Jake asked Etched to teach him how to hunt. It was something he had never learned before, and he wanted to understand the way of life she had grown up with. The two of them rode out early in the morning, while Nayeli stayed back at the ranch to work. Jake felt a sense of anticipation as they rode deeper into the woods. He had always been a practical man, someone who took pride in what he could build with his own hands. But hunting, truly understanding the land and the animals that lived on it, was something he had never fully appreciated until now. Etched led him through the forest with the quiet confidence of someone who had lived there her whole life. She pointed out the signs of wildlife, the broken branches, the footprints in the dirt, the subtle shifts in the air that told her which direction the animals were headed. Jake followed her closely, trying to absorb everything she showed him. For the first time, he felt connected to the land in a way he never had before. It wasn't just about survival. It was about respect. Respect for the land, for the animals, and for each other. By the time the sun began to set, they had found what they were looking for. Jake had caught his first rabbit, and although he felt a deep sense of accomplishment, he also felt a sense of gratitude. The land had given him something, and now he understood that it was a gift that needed to be respected and protected. As they rode back to the ranch, Jake looked at etched, who had been silent for a long while. "Thank you," he said simply. "I don't think I could have learned this on my own." Etched nodded, a faint smile crossing her face. "You're starting to understand," she said softly. When they returned to the ranch, Naili was waiting for them, her smile bright when she saw the rabbit Jake had caught. The three of them stood there for a moment, the warm glow of the fire surrounding them, and for the first time in a long while, Jake felt like they were truly a family. They didn't have all the answers, and they didn't know what the future held, but they had each other. And that, he realized, was enough.